I'm Clara Bennett, 29 years old, and this morning the people who raised me laughed at my inheritance. My father leaned back in his leather chair, shaking his head with mock pity, while my mother covered her smile behind a manicured hand. $10, that was what the lawyer had just read aloud as my share of my grandfather's estate. The room filled with the low hum of amusement polite to anyone outside our family, but cruel enough to sting beneath the surface. I sat still, hands folded, heartbeat echoing in my ears, realizing that even in death, my family found new ways to make me feel small. What none of them knew was that their laughter was the sound of their own undoing. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by the very people who should have believed in you. I was born into the Bennetts, a family that believed success came in perfectly measured steps. My grandfather Harold built our company from a dirt floor workshop to a national name in manufacturing. My father took that legacy and polished it until it gleamed annual galas, magazine spreads, and boardrooms full of men who smiled when he spoke. My mother handled the rest, the right charities, the right friends, the illusion of warmth. And then there was Grant, my brother, who fit the mold perfectly from the start. By high school, he was already practicing speeches for the day he'd take my father's seat. I was different. I loved the quiet parts of life, the way light touched a window at dusk, the hidden stories and worn faces on a subway platform. When I was 12, I saved enough allowance to buy a used camera from a pawn shop. I spent entire afternoons behind that lens trying to capture moments no one else noticed. My parents called it a phase. My father once said, "Art's a nice hobby, Clara, but it doesn't build empires." My mother agreed gently, as she always did. "Your brother has focus," she told me. "You have feelings. Feelings won't feed a legacy." I tried to prove them wrong in quiet ways. I worked part-time jobs, earned scholarships, and studied photography at a small liberal arts college upstate. While Grant traveled Europe and learned mergers, I rented a studio apartment above a bakery and learned light texture and patience. I shot abandoned houses, faded signs, the loneliness of small towns, the kind of truth that didn't belong in the Bennett world. I sent my parents prints once. They never mentioned receiving them. The only one who ever asked about my work was my grandfather. He had slowed with age, but his mind was still sharp. Whenever I visited, he'd pour tea in that heavy silver set and ask softly, "Still taking pictures?" I always nodded a little embarrassed. He'd smile and say, "Keep your eye open, Clara. Seeing clearly is rarer than it seems." I didn't realize until later that those words were a kind of warning. When he passed, I mourned quietly. My parents treated the funeral like a press event, perfect attire, perfect statements, perfect distance. My father gave a eulogy about continuing the Bennett vision, though I couldn't tell if he was speaking about his father or the company. I went home that night with a dull ache in my chest, unsure whether I'd lost the only person who truly saw me. 2 weeks later came the reading of the will. The office downtown smelled of cologne and polished wood, the kind of place where power felt permanent. My parents and Grant were already seated when I arrived, their conversation soft but smug. Around us, cousins and in-laws chatted about vacation homes and trust funds. I sat at the far end of the table, pretending not to notice the sideways glances. Mr. Whitmore, our family attorney, began in his measured voice, distributing properties, stocks, and collections like clockwork. Each name called felt like a confirmation of worth, and then he said mine. To Clara Bennett, he read $10. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. My father chuckled first. "Guess that's what happens when you choose cameras over contracts." My mother shook her head with mock sympathy. "At least he didn't forget you completely." Around the table came polite laughter, low and poisonous. My throat tightened, but I forced a small nod. "Understood," I said, though every syllable tasted bitter. It wasn't about the money, it was about being erased. I looked at my brother, then expecting maybe an ounce of pity, but Grant only shrugged as if to say, "You made your bed." I started to gather my things when Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Actually," he said, adjusting his glasses, "there's a private letter addressed only to Miss Bennett." The room fell silent. For the first time in my life, I saw my parents' expressions shift, not smug, but uncertain. My father frowned. "Private," he repeated. The lawyer nodded. Those were Mr. Bennett's instructions. Every gaze in the room followed me as Mr. Whitmore guided me into an adjoining office. The air felt cooler there, the noise of laughter fading behind the closed door. On the desk lay a single envelope sealed in dark wax. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's steady hand. My pulse quickened as I traced the letters. Whatever lay inside, I knew it would not be small. I didn't open it right away. I stood at the window, looking down at the city that stretched endlessly beneath me, the same city my family ruled from their towers. Somewhere below were the people I used to photograph, the forgotten and unseen. For the first time, I wondered if my grandfather had understood that connection all along. The laughter from the other room seemed distant now, almost irrelevant. Whatever truth waited in that envelope, it belonged to me alone. And when I finally broke the seal, I had no idea that what I was about to read would turn every rule the Bennetts lived by upside down. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I turned it over in my hands before sliding a finger under the wax seal. Inside was a letter written in my grandfather's familiar script, steady, deliberate, the same hand that once built a company from a dirt floor shop. The first line stopped me cold. "My dear Clara, I know what they've done. I needed them to show you who they really are when they think you have nothing." For a long moment I couldn't move. The words blurred as I read on. My grandfather apologized for the spectacle in the conference room, saying he never meant to humiliate me, only to reveal the truth I had refused to see. The $10, he explained, was never my inheritance, it was a test. He had set things in motion months before his death, creating an arrangement that bypassed the public will entirely. According to the enclosed documents, I was the sole beneficiary of something called the Bennett Creative Trust. I frowned, trying to remember if I had ever heard of it, but my mind was blank. He described it as a holding company he had built quietly over decades, independent of the main corporation my father ran. It owned properties, shares, investments, and a private art foundation registered under an alias. And all of it now belonged to me. My throat tightened as I kept reading. The next page was softer, more personal. He wrote that he had watched my work grow often from a distance and had been collecting my photographs under different names. He had kept every print I ever sold online or at small shows. The ones you thought disappeared, he wrote, they were never lost. They were home. He said that in a locked drawer at the gallery he'd established on Beacon Street, I'd find the full collection framed, cataloged, and preserved. My knees went weak. I remembered the old camera he'd given me years ago, the one he said he used before the business consumed him. Some dreams he had told me then don't survive the weight of inheritance. Now I understood. At the bottom of the letter was a small brass key taped to the paper. Beneath it, he'd written a single line, "Top floor Beacon Street. Your real inheritance." I stared at it until my pulse steadied, then carefully refolded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. The air in that office felt lighter now, quieter. Through the glass wall I could still hear the muffled hum of conversation from the other room, my father's booming laugh, my mother's soft, practiced agreement. I stood for a long while before opening the door. When I returned, every eye turned to me. "Everything all right?" Grant asked, half curious, half amused. I nodded, keeping my voice even. "Yes. Just a personal matter." My mother gave a thin smile. I hope it wasn't bad news. I met her eyes for a second, then looked away. "Nothing I can't handle." My father chuckled. $10 should be easy to manage." Their laughter followed me out the door, but it didn't reach me this time. The following morning I met with Mr. Whitmore in his office downtown. He poured coffee without asking, his tone careful but kind. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," he said. "He wanted you to have freedom, not control, not obligation, but the chance to build something of your own." He slid a stack of documents toward me, property deeds, financial statements, and a sealed file labeled Bennett Creative Trust, Primary Beneficiary, Clara Bennett. It didn't feel real. "Everything you need is here," he said, "including the key to the Beacon Street property. I'd advise you to visit soon." I thanked him, unable to find any other words, and left with the envelope clutched against my chest. Beacon Street was quiet that afternoon, the kind of street where every building had history carved into its facade. The address led me to a narrow red brick structure with tall arched windows and a plaque that simply read Bennett Light Studio. My grandfather's handwriting was engraved in small letters beneath it. Inside, sunlight poured through high skylights onto polished concrete floors. Dust floated in the air like silver threads. It wasn't just a gallery, it was a world built for light. Along the walls hung framed photographs. My photographs. I moved closer, heart pounding, tracing my name etched into the small brass tags beneath each one. Every piece was there: the abandoned houses, the cracked windows, the portraits of strangers. He had kept them all. At the far end of the gallery, a glass case stood on a pedestal. Inside was the old film camera he'd given me years ago, the leather strap newly restored. A small card beside it read, "To the one who never looked away." I sat on the nearest bench and let the silence settle. It wasn't triumph I felt, but something deeper understanding. My grandfather hadn't just left me wealth, he'd left me a mirror. This was what he meant when he said seeing clearly was rare. Over the next few days, I avoided calls from my parents. My father sent a brief message about family unity and the company's image. My mother forwarded an invitation to a charity gala with a note suggesting I keep appearances simple. I deleted both. Instead, I focused on the documents Mr. Whitmore had given me. Each page detailed years of careful planning trust transfers, corporate separations, legal safeguards. My grandfather had built a second empire, one designed to protect creativity rather than suppress it. The more I read, the more I saw his quiet rebellion against the family machine. I spent that week at the studio cleaning, sorting, and learning the space. There was a small office upstairs with an oak desk, a typewriter, and dozens of folders labeled in his precise handwriting: community programs, artist grants, education, outreach. Each one contained proposals some decades old. I realized he had been laying the groundwork for something bigger, a foundation that blended business with purpose. I ran my fingers over the papers, feeling the weight of what he'd entrusted me with. By evening, I stood by the tall windows overlooking the city. Below, the streets glowed with evening traffic, alive and restless. Inside the studio was quiet, except for the hum of the old radiator. On the desk sat the brass key he'd left me glinting in the light. I turned it over in my hand and knew that what came next had to be deliberate. This wasn't revenge, it was inheritance redefined. 2 weeks later, I returned to Mr. Whitmore's office to finalize the transfer. He reviewed the last of the signatures, then looked up with a faint smile. "It's done," he said. "You now hold controlling interest in the Bennett Creative Trust." He paused, then added, "You'll have decisions to make soon. The family will find out eventually." I nodded. "I know. I just need time." When I stepped outside, a cold wind brushed against my face, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. I didn't drive back to my apartment. Instead, I returned to the Beacon Street studio and unlocked the top floor. The space above the gallery was open and sunlit, furnished simply with canvases, easels, and old wooden shelves. Against one wall sat a drafting table with another envelope resting on top. My name again written in that same steady hand. Inside was a note and a thin folder. "Clara," it read, "I built many things in my life, but this is the one I believe in most. The company downstairs was born from my hands. This place is born from yours. Do not waste it trying to prove them wrong. Use it to prove yourself right." Beneath the letter was a photograph I'd taken years ago, one of an old man looking out a train window. On the back, he'd written, "See clearly. Build kindly." I placed it on the windowsill beside the camera. The city below blurred into soft lights as dusk settled, and I realized this was the beginning of something new. The laughter from that conference room felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Soon, they would learn the truth. But when they did, it wouldn't be from a headline or a lawyer's announcement. It would be standing under these same skylights, surrounded by the work they once dismissed. I locked the studio that night with the brass key warm in my palm. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, the same smell that used to fill my grandfather's study. I looked up at the windows glowing softly against the dark and whispered, "Thank you." Then I walked away, already knowing that my silence would be the loudest answer they'd ever receive. The studio became my refuge in the weeks that followed. Each morning I arrived early, the city still half asleep, and opened the tall glass doors to let in the cool air from Beacon Street. I spent my days sorting through the archive my grandfather left behind, boxes of film rolls, journals, receipts, and handwritten notes in that same steady script. Some boxes held my early photographs, the ones I had sold for barely enough to pay rent. He had bought them all through art dealers and anonymous accounts keeping a record of every purchase. On the inside of one lid, he had written a single phrase, "Keep going, Clara. You're building something they can't see yet." Each discovery felt like a conversation that had never ended. I found notebooks filled with sketches for gallery layouts, drafts for community projects, and lists of local artists he had once funded quietly. The more I uncovered, the clearer his vision became. He hadn't built this place just for me. He had built it for the kind of people the Bennett family ignored, those who created without approval or profit. I spent long nights under the warm glow of the desk lamp cataloging everything until my eyes blurred. One evening I noticed a small drawer beneath the old drafting table. Inside was a bundle of photographs tied with twine. They were of me taken years ago when I thought no one was watching, setting up a camera tripod on an empty street, crouched behind a lens in the rain, carrying my portfolio on the subway. He must have sent someone to capture those moments, not out of surveillance, but pride. For the first time, I felt seen in a way my family never allowed. By the end of that week, the silence broke. My mother called. "Clara, we'd like to have dinner." "Just the family," she said, her tone controlled but uneasy. I agreed, knowing it wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. The restaurant they chose was one my father favored, a private club with polished mahogany and waiters who moved like ghosts. When I walked in, the three of them were already seated. Grant gave a quick nod, his phone on the table beside him. My father barely looked up from his glass of scotch, so he began. "Once I sat down, I hear you've been spending a lot of time in that old building on Beacon Street." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "It was part of Granddad's estate," I said. "He wanted me to have it." My mother smiled thinly. "A photography studio. How charming. I'm sure you'll find something to do with it." I didn't respond. My father leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You understand that building used to fall under company holdings. We're handling the estate review next quarter. You should be prepared to transfer management back to the board." I met his eyes for the first time. "That won't be necessary," I said evenly. "It's not under Bennett Manufacturing. It's a private trust." The pause that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. My father blinked once, then sat back slowly. "A trust," he repeated. My mother's fork clinked against her plate. Grant frowned, glancing between us. What trust? I could see their confusion turning into something colder, fear mixed with disbelief. My father forced a smile. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Your grandfather's affairs were reviewed by our attorneys." I reached into my bag and placed a copy of the legal documents on the table. "Then they missed this," I said softly. "It was handled by Mr. Whitmore personally." For a moment, no one spoke. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine. My father's voice, when it came again, was quieter. "You should have come to us first." I folded the papers back into my bag. "You laughed at me," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I didn't think there was anything left to come to you about." My mother exhaled, shaking her head. "You're being dramatic. It was a joke." I looked at her, remembering the sound of her laughter at the will reading. It didn't feel like one. The waiter approached to clear our plates, breaking the tension. My father's expression had shifted from annoyance to calculation. "Fine," he said finally. "If this is what Harold left you, then handle it as you wish. But don't expect us to clean up the mess when it falls apart." I nodded once. I wouldn't dream of it. When dinner ended, I walked out into the cool night without saying goodbye. Behind me, I heard my mother whisper something to my father, her voice tight. I didn't look back. The next morning, I met with Mr. Whitmore again. He seemed unsurprised when I told him about the dinner. "They'll come around eventually," he said, "or they won't. Either way, your grandfather wanted you to move forward." He handed me another folder, this one labeled Operations Transition. Inside were financial details and the first steps toward full control of the trust. "He made sure you'd be ready," Whitmore added. "There's enough here to fund projects for years if you manage them well." I spent the next several weeks planning quietly. I hired 2 assistants, one for administrative work, another for outreach. The first, Julia Marks, a soft-spoken but sharp organizer in her early 40s, had managed several nonprofit arts programs in Boston. The second, Eli Sanders, 25, was a recent graduate with an eye for curation and the kind of enthusiasm I'd once had. We cleaned, painted, and cataloged until the space began to breathe again. It was no longer just my grandfather's vision. It was starting to become mine. By early spring, we held our first small exhibition, a preview for local photographers who had never been shown publicly. The turnout was modest but sincere, teachers, students, and a few community leaders. I watched as people moved through the gallery, pausing to study the images of forgotten streets and unseen faces. When an older man stopped in front of one of my pieces and said quietly, "You captured what it feels like to be invisible," I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I wasn't proving myself to my family. I was simply existing where I belonged. That night after locking up, I found a message waiting on my phone. It was from my brother. "Mom and Dad want to know what your end game is. Call me." I didn't reply. Instead, I walked through the empty studio, stopping at the glass case where my grandfather's camera rested. The faint city lights reflected off the lens like a quiet signal. I touched the edge of the display, whispering, "It's only beginning." Over the next month, whispers began to reach me, relatives asking questions, board members requesting meetings, even my father's secretary calling to confirm your future involvement with Bennett Manufacturing. I declined them all. Every rejection seemed to echo louder than the last, yet the more noise they made, the steadier I became. I had learned from my grandfather that power didn't need to announce itself. It simply needed to stand. By summer, invitations for our official grand opening were ready, crisp envelopes embossed with gold lettering that read, "Bennett Light Studio presents The Inheritance of Vision." Inside the details were simple date time and a single line at the bottom, "By invitation only." I sent the first 3 to my parents and brother. Then I waited. As I sealed the last envelope, I looked around the studio one more time. The walls were lined with photographs from both my collection and those of the new artists we'd supported. Light pooled on the hardwood floors in soft gold. It was everything my grandfather had imagined and everything my family had never believed possible. When I turned off the lights that night, the city outside shimmered through the windows, quiet and vast. I knew the next time those doors opened, everything would change. The laughter that once followed me out of that conference room would soon be replaced by silence and then by something much louder. The night before the grand opening, the studio was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air vents and the faint echo of my footsteps across the hardwood floors. Every photograph was perfectly mounted, each light positioned just as I'd planned. I stood in the center of the main gallery and let the stillness settle around me. The invitation list had been confirmed that morning. Local art critics, donors, educators, and a few of my grandfather's old business partners who had quietly supported his vision. My parents and brother were among them, their names printed neatly like everyone else's. I wondered if they'd even read the embossed line at the bottom, "Bennett Light Studio presents The Inheritance of Vision." I stayed late checking the displays one last time. Julia came downstairs with her coat over her arm, smiling softly. "Everything looks beautiful," she said. "He'd be proud." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Eli appeared behind her arms full of catalog books and asked if I wanted to lock up or have him do it. "I'll close tonight," I said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." When they left, the sound of the door latch echoed through the space like the end of a long chapter. By morning, the city air was crisp and bright. Trucks passed on Beacon Street, splashing through puddles from the night's rain. I arrived early before the caterers or the florists to make sure everything was in place. The scent of fresh lilies filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic smell of the lighting fixtures warming up. I walked from room to room, adjusting small details, straightening a frame here, polishing glass there, until the space felt alive. On the central pedestal, under the warm glow of a spotlight, sat a single framed check. $10. Beneath it, a plaque read, gifted to Clara Bennett at the will reading of Harold J. Bennett. Value priceless. As the hour approached, the first guests began to arrive. Shoes clicked softly on the polished floors, murmurs filled the hall, and camera shutters snapped in the distance. The gallery lights reflected in their glasses, painting their faces with golden hues. I greeted visitors one by one, listening to their questions, thanking them for coming, guiding them toward the photographs that told the story of forgotten places and unseen people. The energy was calm but charged the way air feels before a storm. I saw my parents before they saw me. They entered together, polished and poised, with Grant walking just behind. My father's suit was pressed to perfection, my mother's pearls catching every bit of light. For a brief second their expressions softened as they looked around, perhaps expecting a modest student showcase. Then they noticed the sign above the entrance, "The Inheritance of Vision Works" by Clara Bennett. My father's jaw tightened. My mother adjusted her necklace. Grant hesitated, scanning the room like he'd missed a memo. They approached slowly. "Clara," my mother said, her tone carefully neutral, "this is quite the turnout." My father's eyes swept over the displays. "Impressive space," he said, each word weighed. "Who funded all this?" I met his gaze. "You'll find out soon." He frowned, but before he could respond, Julia appeared beside me to whisper that Mr. Whitmore had arrived. I excused myself and walked with her toward the small stage near the back of the room. Mr. Whitmore looked different outside the conference room, more relaxed, almost proud. He greeted a few guests before finding me. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "As I'll ever be." He gave a small nod, then stepped onto the platform and tapped the microphone. The low hum of conversation faded as people turned to face him. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Thank you for joining us at Bennett Light Studio. Tonight marks the realization of a vision." Harold Bennett began many years ago. I stood beside him as he spoke, scanning the crowd. My mother's expression had tightened into polite confusion. My father crossed his arms. Grant's phone was in his hand, though he wasn't scrolling anymore. "Many of you knew Harold as a businessman," Whitmore continued, "but few knew him as an artist. He believed creativity was the soul of progress. And in his final act, he entrusted that legacy not to his company, but to someone who shared that same vision." He turned toward me. "Tonight, I have the honor of introducing the founder of this studio, the director of the Bennett Creative Trust, and the rightful heir to Harold Bennett's artistic estate, Miss Clara Bennett." The applause that followed seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. I stepped forward slowly, my heartbeat matching the rhythm of the clapping hands. For a moment, I caught my mother's expression. Surprise, disbelief, something between them. My father's face had gone pale, his mouth a thin line. Grant looked frozen, like he was trying to process what he'd just heard. I took the microphone and spoke briefly, thanking everyone for being there, talking about how art could restore what business often forgot. I mentioned my grandfather's belief that legacy wasn't measured by inheritance, but by impact. My words were steady, though my hands trembled slightly. When the speech ended, guests resumed their soft chatter, moving through the exhibits again. My parents approached. My father's voice was low. "You blindsided us," he said. "That wasn't your place." I met his eyes. "You made it my place when you laughed at me." My mother touched my arm lightly, her tone sharp beneath her whisper. "We're still your family." I took a slow breath. "And yet you made sure I'd never forget that I wasn't enough." Grant looked uneasy. "You could have told us," he said. "We would have helped." I turned to him. "You only help when there's credit involved." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. For the first time, the silence between us didn't feel like defeat. It felt like distance earned. Mr. Whitmore joined us, glass of champagne in hand. "Beautiful turnout," he said smoothly. "The press will have quite the story to tell." My father didn't respond, just glanced at him with the look of a man realizing too late that he'd been outmaneuvered. My mother smiled tightly, excused herself, and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. My father followed a few steps behind. Grant lingered for a moment, then slipped out after them. I turned back to the crowd. The atmosphere had changed lighter, somehow more open. Guests stopped me to offer congratulations, to ask about upcoming programs, to share how the photographs moved them. I answered each question, listening to their stories in return. Somewhere behind me, Julia whispered to Eli, "She did it. Later, when the crowd thinned, I stood near the glass case again, the $10 check glowing softly under its light. The plaque beneath it seemed to shimmer in the reflection. Sometimes the smallest inheritance is the greatest test. I traced the edge of the display with my fingertips, thinking of my grandfather's quiet smile and the day he handed me his old camera. The lesson had taken years to unfold, but I understood now he hadn't left me this to hurt them. He'd left it to free me. Outside, the rain had started again, soft and steady against the tall windows. Guests began to leave in pairs, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers on the street. I thanked them at the door, each goodbye carrying a quiet satisfaction that I hadn't known in years. When the last visitor stepped out, I turned off the gallery lights one by one. The city lights outside cast faint reflections over the photographs, as if the walls themselves were alive. In the silence that followed, I realized the laughter that once echoed through that conference room was gone. What remained was the sound of my own steps steady, certain as I walked through the studio that now belonged completely to me. And though I knew the family storm wasn't over, I also knew it couldn't touch what had been built here. I reached the front door, turned the key in the lock, and looked back one last time. The gallery glowed softly behind the glass, filled with the faces and stories that had brought me here. Tomorrow would bring the questions, the phone calls, maybe even the headlines. But tonight, there was peace, the kind my grandfather had promised, in every quiet note he left behind. The night after the opening, I barely slept. Every sound from the city below felt amplified, the distant hum of traffic, a siren somewhere far away, the soft rattle of wind against the windows. I kept replaying the night in my head, the applause, my father's stunned silence, my mother's eyes darting around the gallery like she was searching for an escape. It should have felt like victory, but instead there was a hollow calm, like the air after a storm that hadn't quite passed. I stood by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, watching dawn light stretch over the rooftops. Beacon Street was quiet again, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small there. By noon, the news had already spread. Articles appeared online describing the event as a rare merging of legacy and art, crediting my grandfather's foresight and my work in equal measure. The story wasn't just about photography anymore, it was about inheritance, the kind that couldn't be measured in numbers. My phone buzzed with calls. I ignored messages from people who'd once looked through me, now asking for interviews or quotes. Even my father's name appeared in a statement he hadn't authorized. The company's PR office had tried to distance Bennett Manufacturing from the gallery entirely, which only made reporters dig deeper. I spent the next few days at the studio sorting through correspondence with Julia and Eli. The space had taken on a new life overnight. Students stopped by eager to volunteer. Local papers wanted photo access. Whitmore came by twice to review a few pending documents, calm as ever. He warned me that my parents might reach out soon, not through me, but through their lawyers. When pride loses power, he said, setting down his pen, it looks for loopholes. I nodded, though his words lingered longer than I wanted them to. He was right. The first formal letter arrived that Friday, printed on the family's legal stationery. It was polite, impersonal, and direct. My father's signature sat at the bottom beneath a request for a clarification of ownership regarding the Beacon Street property and the creative trust attached to it. I didn't respond. Instead, I asked Whitmore to handle it. His reply was brief but firm. All matters were settled in accordance with Harold Bennett's last verified directives. There are no grounds for dispute. That evening, I went upstairs to the studio's top floor to clear my thoughts. The sun was setting behind the skyline, flooding the room with amber light. I opened one of my grandfather's old journals, the one labeled Vision and Responsibility. His handwriting was tidy, his thoughts practical. On one page he'd written, "A family name means nothing if the people carrying it forget why it mattered in the first place." I traced the ink with my thumb, realizing he'd prepared for this moment long before I could have imagined. A week later, Grant showed up unannounced. Julia found him in the lobby and called upstairs before letting him in. When he stepped into the gallery, he looked uneasy, still dressed in his usual tailored suit, but his confidence had slipped. "Mom's worried about you," he said, skipping any greeting. She says you've turned this whole thing into a spectacle. I stayed behind the front desk letting him talk. Dad's furious, he added. You embarrassed the family, Clara, publicly. I studied him for a moment. Did you ever ask yourself why Grandpa left it to me? I said quietly. He hesitated, eyes narrowing. You think you deserved it? His voice carried a mix of disbelief and resentment. You walked away from everything he built. I shook my head. No, I walked away from everything you and Dad turned it into. He scoffed, but it sounded more tired than angry. They're still our parents, he said finally. Whatever they did, they raised us. I met his gaze. They raised us to perform, not to live. You know that as well as I do. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders dropped. I just came to tell you they're not done, he said, turning toward the door. They're talking about board votes, about freezing assets. You're making them look weak. They did that themselves, I replied softly. He paused, glanced over his shoulder once more, then left without another word. When the door shut, I leaned against the counter, feeling the echo of his words. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and quiet planning. Whitmore assured me that the trust's structure was airtight, that my parents had no leverage left. Still, the tension in the air felt heavier with each passing day. My mother's social circles began whispering about family division. Anonymous comments appeared under articles calling the gallery a stunt, dismissing my work as a clever inheritance grab. It didn't hurt the way it used to. It just clarified what I was up against. One night, Julia stayed late helping me prepare an upcoming exhibition schedule. She noticed the fatigue in my voice and stopped mid-sentence. You don't have to prove anything anymore, she said gently. You've already changed the story. I smiled faintly. That's what worries them, I said. She nodded understanding. Before she left, she added quietly, You remind them of what they could have been. The next morning brought a different kind of message. A handwritten note had been left at the front desk with no envelope, just my name on the outside. I recognized my mother's handwriting instantly, delicate, composed. Inside only one line. Please call me before it's too late. I folded it once and set it aside. That weekend I walked through the gallery alone. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, landing on the display that had started it all, the framed check for $10. Visitors often stopped there first, reading the plaque aloud before moving deeper into the exhibit. I watched from a distance as a young couple stood before it, whispering. The woman smiled softly and said, Sometimes that's all it takes, a spark. I didn't interrupt. When they left, I stood in the same spot and realized how different the sound of that laughter would feel now. Later that night, as rain began to fall, I sat upstairs in the studio with one of my cameras. I hadn't taken a photograph in weeks. The city lights flickered against the wet streets below, reflections bending in the puddles. I adjusted the focus and took a single shot through the glass, a view of the street where it had all begun. The shutter's click echoed like a heartbeat. For a moment it felt like my grandfather was there beside me, steadying my hand. I knew the next step would not be about defense. It would be about direction. The trust wasn't just mine to protect. It was mine to grow. I began outlining a proposal for a residency program, one that would fund young artists from small towns and public schools, giving them access to the resources they'd never had. Eli would help with the outreach. Julia would handle logistics. It was the kind of future my grandfather had imagined but never got to build. As I finished the draft, I heard my phone buzz again. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. We need to talk. Dad's not well. I stared at it for a long moment, uncertain if it was true or just another way to pull me back in. Either way, I knew the next conversation with my family would be different. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, tapping gently against the windows. I stood and looked out at the city, the camera still warm in my hand. Tomorrow I would decide whether to answer that message. For now, I let the silence stretch, knowing that whatever came next, the balance of power had already shifted, and this time it wasn't theirs to take back. I didn't answer Grant's message right away. For 2 days, I kept my phone face down on the desk while I worked through the new residency plans. Every so often, I caught myself glancing at the screen, half expecting another text to appear. None came. On the third morning, I woke before sunrise and found myself standing by the window again, watching the street below glow under the first streaks of daylight. The city was waking up calm and indifferent, and somehow that steadiness gave me the courage to decide. I called him. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was quieter than I remembered. "Dad's in the hospital," he said. "Chest pains. They're keeping him for observation." I felt a flicker of something, shock maybe, but the words didn't fully land. "Is he stable?" I asked. "For now," Grant said. "Mom's been there all night. She asked if you'd come." That afternoon I drove to St. Luke's, the same hospital where my grandfather had spent his last weeks. The halls smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, the kind of sterile comfort that never quite settles. I found my mother sitting by the waiting room window, her posture perfect, even in exhaustion. When she saw me, she stood too quickly, like she'd been rehearsing the moment. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice trembled, the first crack I'd heard in years. We stood in silence for a moment. Then she added, "He's asleep. They said it wasn't a full heart attack, but close. Stress, mostly." Her eyes darted away when she said it. I nodded, unsure what to say. Through the glass wall, I could see my father lying in the bed, pale against the white sheets, a monitor blinking steadily beside him. For the first time, he looked small, fragile even. When I stepped into the room, the soft beeping filled the quiet. He opened his eyes halfway. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "Didn't think you'd come." I stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped. "Grant said you weren't well." He gave a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Must have scared you. That's one way to get a visit." I almost turned to leave, but something kept me there. He shifted slightly, wincing. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he said. "The press can't stop talking about you." His tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was uncertain, like he was trying to balance old pride with fresh resentment. "It's not about a name," I replied softly. "It's about what Grandpa wanted." He closed his eyes for a long moment, then said, "He always had a strange sense of justice." I didn't respond. There was no apology in his words, just fatigue. But for once, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a pause. After a while, the nurse entered to check his vitals. My mother returned to the doorway, her hands clutching her purse strap. "You should rest," she told him. He nodded, already drifting back to sleep. Outside, she and I walked toward the elevators. "He's been under so much pressure," she said quietly. "The business, the articles, everything, it's taken a toll." I looked at her. He built his life on control. Maybe it's hard to see what he can't command anymore. She flinched at that, then sighed. "You're more like him than you realize," she said. I wasn't sure if it was meant as comfort or warning. We reached the lobby where Grant was waiting with a paper cup of coffee. He looked relieved to see us together. "The doctor says he'll be fine," he said, "but he needs to take it easy." My mother nodded, though her face stayed tight. I told them I'd check in again later, then left. The air outside felt heavy with late summer humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin and slows your breathing. I stood by the parking lot for a while before driving home. That evening, I sat in the studio with the lights off, the city's glow spilling through the windows. I thought about the way my father looked in that hospital bed, how quickly the man who had built an empire could shrink into frailty. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it reminded me that power never lasts. On the desk beside me sat one of my grandfather's photographs, an image of a cracked clock face half buried in dirt. I hadn't understood it before. Now it made perfect sense. The next day, Julia found me editing images for the next exhibit. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, setting a cup of coffee down beside me. I smiled faintly. Hospitals don't help. She hesitated, then asked, "Are you going back?" I nodded. He asked me to. When I arrived, my father was sitting upright, staring out the window. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. "You came," he said without turning. "Didn't think you'd waste another afternoon on me." I pulled a chair closer to the bed. "You wanted to talk." He nodded slowly. "About your grandfather, about what he left you." He looked tired, but his voice was steady. "When I was your age, he told me I'd have to earn everything I inherited. I thought I had. Turns out I only inherited his fear of losing control, of being forgotten." He paused, then added, "I see now he left you something different." For the first time, his words carried no edge. I sat quietly, letting him continue. "He believed in you," he said, "even when I didn't. Maybe that's why I resented you." He leaned back, breathing shallow. "You remind me of the part of him that never cared about the money." I didn't know how to respond. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. After a while, he reached for a small notebook on the bedside table and handed it to me. This was his. He gave it to me years ago, said it was for the next Bennett who needed to remember why we started. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. I turned it over carefully in my hands. "You should keep it," I said. "No," he replied. "You're the one who'll actually read it." That night, I brought the notebook back to the studio. Inside the first page carried a single sentence in my grandfather's writing, "Build what outlives you." Beneath it were sketches, notes, and ideas that spanned decades, a lifetime of quiet planning. I realized he hadn't just trusted me with an inheritance. He'd trusted me to finish something he never could. Over the next week, as my father recovered, my mother called a few times. Her tone softened each time, though she never said much beyond updates. Grant stopped by once to tell me the company was stable again. "He's stepping back," he said, finally letting me take over. I wished him luck. He hesitated before leaving. "You know, Mom said Grandpa used to call you the eye of the family. She thought it meant you were a dreamer. Maybe he meant something else." After he left, I sat at my desk with the notebook open and the city lights flickering against the glass. The pages were filled with blueprints for community spaces, art centers, schools, places, meant for connection. It was the same vision I'd started with the residency program. The realization hit me quietly but completely. I wasn't just continuing his work. I was finally giving it roots. The next morning, I called Julia and Eli in for a meeting. We spread the notebook across the table and began mapping out an expansion plan, one that would bring the foundation beyond Beacon Street into smaller towns, giving local artists the chance to create without limits. As I watched them lean over the sketches, excitement in their voices, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about carrying something forward. That night, before closing the studio, I picked up my camera again. I walked through each room, capturing the light as it fell across the walls, the photographs, the quiet reflections in the glass. When I reached the front door, I turned the lens toward the street, toward the life waiting outside. The shutter clicked softly. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt right. The expansion plan took shape faster than any of us expected. Within 3 months, we had secured partnerships with 3 community centers, one in Vermont, another in Ohio, and a small coastal town in Oregon. Each location would host workshops, local exhibits, and mentorship programs for artists who had never had access to gallery spaces. Julia handled the logistics, Eli curated the submissions, and I focused on designing each program around what my grandfather had always believed, that art belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford it. I spent most mornings at the Beacon Street studio, working from the same desk where my grandfather once planned his company's rise. Some days, sunlight pooled across the papers. Other days, the room was dim and quiet, except for the scratch of my pen. The notebook he'd left me never left my side. Whenever I felt unsure, I'd flip to one of his old sketches or short notes, half-formed ideas about collaboration, community, and generosity. His handwriting had a way of steadying me, reminding me that this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about finishing what he started. One afternoon, Julia walked in carrying a folder stamped with the foundation's new logo. "We've received over 100 applications," she said, smiling. "Half from artists under 25. The stories are incredible." She handed me one, a young woman from Kansas who'd been photographing her small farming town after a series of droughts. Her images captured resilience and decay in equal measure. "She's exactly the kind of voice your grandfather wanted to uplift," Julia said. I nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. Later that evening, as I was locking up, a familiar number flashed on my phone. It was my mother. I hesitated before answering. Her tone was calm, almost measured. "Your father's home," she said. "He's recovering well. We've been talking a lot about things." I waited, unsure where this was leading. "He'd like to see the studio," she added. "Both of us would." The next morning, they arrived together. My father walked slower than I remembered, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. My mother stayed close beside him, her expression unreadable. I led them through the main gallery where the current exhibit, a collection of photographs from the residency applicants, hung along the walls. "These are all new voices," I said quietly. "We're showcasing artists from smaller towns first. It's what the trust was built for." My father studied each piece carefully. "He would have liked this," he murmured after a while. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. My mother traced her fingers along a nearby frame. "It's beautiful," she said. "I didn't realize you'd built something this alive." Her tone carried surprise more than pride, but I accepted it for what it was. When we reached the final room, I paused before the display case that held the $10 check. My parents stood beside me, silent for a long moment. My father's reflection in the glass looked older, almost haunted. That day he said quietly, "I thought he was punishing you. I see now he was teaching us." I turned toward him. "He didn't want revenge," I said. "He wanted renewal." My father nodded slowly. Maybe I needed to be humbled to understand that. My mother exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time. "He always said legacy wasn't about money," she said. "I used to think it was just something he told reporters." There was a trace of regret in her voice, but also acceptance. "You've done well, Clara." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her. We spent the next hour in quiet conversation about the foundation, about Grandpa, about the way families sometimes lose themselves, chasing what they think they're owed. My father didn't say much, but every so often he'd nod, eyes distant, as if revisiting years of decisions. When they left, my mother hugged me for the first time in more than a decade. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly, "and so am I." That evening I stood in the same spot after the gallery lights dimmed. The air still held their presence, the faint trace of my father's cologne and my mother's perfume mixing in the quiet. For the first time, the space didn't feel like a rebellion. It felt like home. I thought of my grandfather's notebook and the words on its first page, "Build what outlives you." He had written it for himself, but it now felt like a message for all of us. The following week, the first residency class arrived. 12 young artists from across the country, each carrying stories that could fill an entire lifetime. Julia organized a welcome dinner in the gallery, and as I looked around the long table, laughter and conversation echoed through the space like music. Eli played host effortlessly, guiding them through introductions while I watched from the end of the table. One of the residents, a shy sculptor named Maya Collins, approached me afterward. She was small, with paint stains on her hands and a nervous energy that reminded me of myself years ago. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "When you started, did you ever feel like no one would understand what you were trying to do?" I smiled. "All the time," I said. "But you keep doing it anyway. The right people will find you." Her eyes softened with relief. "Thank you," she said. "That helps." After they all left for the evening, I lingered in the gallery, the empty plates and half-finished glasses still scattered across the tables. I imagined my grandfather standing there, hands folded behind his back, taking it all in. He'd always believed that art could bridge what pride had broken. Now I could see that he'd been right. A few days later, a letter arrived from Mr. Whitmore. It wasn't business-related this time, just a simple note in his careful handwriting. "Your grandfather would have called this justice, but I think he'd call it balance. I hope you keep it that way." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same drawer where I kept his first letter. The months that followed were steady and full. The Foundation's programs grew, and soon the first satellite studio in Ohio was ready to open. Local newspapers began covering the story again, but this time the tone was different, respectful, curious, even inspired. My father sent a small donation anonymously through Whitmore's office, though I recognized the handwriting on the attached note for the next generation. That winter snow dusted the city, and Beacon Street turned quiet again. On the anniversary of my grandfather's passing, I hosted a small remembrance gathering in the gallery. Friends, residents, and a few family members came. We lit candles along the windows and projected some of his old photographs on the walls. The air felt heavy with memory, but also gratitude. As the last candle flickered, I walked toward the display case one final time. The $10 check still sat beneath the glass, framed by the same plaque. I rested my hand against it and whispered, "We built it, Grandpa. It's alive." Outside, the snow continued to fall soft and unhurried, blanketing the city in quiet peace. I stood there until the lights dimmed, knowing that even if my family and I never fully repaired what had been broken, something better had risen from its place, something lasting. When I finally stepped outside, the cold air hit my face sharp and clean. Across the street, the gallery's windows glowed softly against the snow. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in my grandfather's shadow. I was standing in his light, and though I didn't know what challenges still waited ahead, I knew one thing for certain: the legacy he'd entrusted to me had found its purpose, and so had I. Tomorrow the doors would open again, and new voices would walk through them, the kind that could change everything quietly, one photograph at a time. Snow still clung to the sidewalks the next morning, melting slowly under the pale winter sun. I arrived early at the studio long before anyone else. The gallery lights were dim just enough to see the outlines of the photographs that had defined this chapter of my life. Each image seemed to breathe on its own, alive with the stories of people who had once been invisible and now stood in quiet recognition. For the first time, the stillness didn't feel empty, it felt full. I made my way upstairs to the top floor where my grandfather's old notebooks still lay open on the desk. The pages had yellowed a bit more since I first found them, the ink softening around the edges, but his handwriting was steady, almost timeless. I ran my hand over the first page again, the words I'd memorized by heart. "Build what outlives you." It had carried me through every decision, every risk, every quiet night spent wondering if I was doing the right thing. And now, standing in the morning light, I finally knew I was. Downstairs, the hum of activity began: footsteps, laughter, the clatter of frames being hung for the next exhibit. Julia arrived first, balancing coffee cups in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "You're here early," she said, smiling as she handed me a cup. "Habit," I replied. "I like seeing it wake up." Eli came in a few minutes later, scarf still wrapped around his neck, cheeks red from the cold. "The new artists are setting up in the West Wing," he said. "They're nervous, but the good kind." I looked at them both, realizing how much this place had grown, not just in size, but in spirit. What started as one man's hidden dream had become something larger, something living, breathing, shared. It was no longer about inheritance or revenge or family names. It was about creation. It was about the quiet, persistent work of turning pain into purpose. A little before noon, I stepped outside with my camera. The air was crisp, the kind that stings your lungs but clears your head. Across the street, the gallery's name, Bennett Light Studio, gleamed faintly in the sunlight. I lifted the camera and took a single photograph. The frame captured the building, the snow, the soft reflection of the city behind it. I knew it would be the last picture of this chapter. A few weeks later, the foundation launched its national program. We called it the Lens Initiative, a project that gave grants to small-town photographers documenting the beauty and struggle of their own communities. Applications poured in from across the country: teachers, factory workers, single parents, students with borrowed cameras. Every story reminded me why my grandfather believed art was more than talent. It was testimony. My parents attended the first award ceremony, quietly sitting near the back of the room. My father still moved slowly, but his eyes followed every young artist as they spoke. When the final recipient, a teenage boy from West Virginia, thanked the foundation for seeing him before the world did, I noticed my mother wipe her eyes. After the applause faded, she touched my hand gently. "You did something good," she said, "better than we ever did." There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence that followed. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind with the lights low. The gallery was empty again, just like it had been the night I first opened it. But this time, the quiet wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I thought about my grandfather's camera, resting in its glass case downstairs, the same one he'd handed me years ago, with that single warning, "Don't let them take your eye." He had been talking about vision, yes, but also about courage, the kind it takes to keep seeing clearly when others try to blind you with doubt. In the end, that was the real inheritance he left me. Not wealth or buildings or control, but clarity. The freedom to choose what kind of legacy I wanted to build and who I wanted to become while building it. Now, when people ask what the foundation stands for, I tell them it's simple. It stands for light, for truth, for the ordinary people who refuse to disappear. And maybe that's all my grandfather ever wanted to remind us, that every life, no matter how small, deserves to be seen. Before I turned out the lights, I took one last walk through the main hall. The photographs caught the faint glimmer of the city's streetlights outside, as if holding on to the glow just a little longer. I stopped at the display case where the $10 check still sat beneath the glass. For years it had been a symbol of humiliation, then a reminder of justice. Now it was something else entirely, a quiet monument to endurance. I smiled, whispering, "You were right, Grandpa." They did laugh too soon. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cold night air, the snow had started again, soft, slow, steady. I tilted my head back, letting it touch my face. The street was silent except for the sound of my footsteps, each one carrying me forward. Life has a way of bringing us full circle, but not to where we began, to where we were always meant to be. The studio's windows glowed behind me, warm against the dark, a beacon for anyone still finding their way. And as I walked home through the quiet city streets, I thought about everyone who'd ever been told they were less than what they truly are. To them I would say, don't stop creating, don't stop believing in your own light. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity and kindness can outlast everything else. And wherever you are tonight, may you keep your own light burning bright.